external timer. All tournament policies still stands. Equity policies also still stand in this round. I'll be using an external timer too. If you're still speaking and your time is up, I am going to unmute to stop your speech. I think we should try to avoid that though. Yeah. So on the motion before the House, I welcome the Prime Minister. Ready when you are.
Yeah, if you have a POI, just mute. I'm not looking at the chat space at all. I'm going to be beginning very, very soon. Let me just set my time. Clock. Timer. Okay, cool. Beginning in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, the House. We believe that today's debate in itself is one that is very, very clear. And our burden is simply to show why we think it makes sense for these oppressed minorities to generally be the first people that are necessarily sent to these places in and of themselves. The very first case that we'll bring to you from side government is that we believe that justice should necessarily serve as foundational design. The case is quite simple. We believe that we should found a new world on justice and not necessarily to replicate the moral hierarchies that destroyed the old one in the first place. Prioritizing oppressed minorities reconstitutes humanity's moral order and corrects systemic moral debts. The mechanisms to prove this is quite simple. The first is that the selection body uses things like historical and sociological data to identify populations that have been historically oppressed, colonized groups, enslaved populations, ethnic minorities, under apartheid-like systems and stuff like that. We believe that the first waves are composed primarily of these groups with governance structures, giving them decisive design power over political, economic, and cultural institutions in and of themselves. Why do we think that this in itself is something that we should do? The first reason is because of the whole idea of moral debt that exists. We believe that humanity as a collective owes reparations for centuries of systemic violence. The new planet is the last chance to discharge that debt meaningfully. We believe that these individuals, especially because they've been historically oppressed in and of themselves, especially within the purview of the old world, we believe it's only fair in terms of repaying back that moral debt as a form of reparation for these individuals in themselves to be the first settlers within these places. But two, it's on the basis or on the principle of foundational justice. The first settlers will do things like define the norms, define laws, and power structures of the new world. Allowing historically oppressed groups to set the foundation prevents the recreation of oppressive systems. The idea here is quite simple. We can't trust people that created, can't trust an offender to necessarily, still get the same responsibility that they had in the first instance. To the extent where the other individuals in themselves that, were majoritarian government in themselves were oppressive, we believe that it only makes sense for us to necessarily give this power to the people that were not necessarily, quote and unquote, part of those oppressive regimes in the first instance. There's more, they have a more moral high ground in and of themselves. But three is that we think that it speaks to the legitimacy of the new world, in the sense that a just founding gives moral legitimacy to the new planet civilization. Otherwise, it would be tainted by the same injustice that doomed Earth. You need to understand the comparative, because the comparative that would most likely come from this guy is, let's have meritocratic or random selection. The problem with meritocratic is that oftentimes, if you want to do that as well, there's no mechanism for you to necessarily be able to decide that. But even if that exists in the first instance, it's something that is mostly going to be still oppressive in itself. And two is that despite the fact that these individuals in themselves can be classified as being oppressed minority group, there's no way for them to necessarily fiat that you won't necessarily have people like scientists or people that are skilled in diverse fields, even within these particular individuals in and of themselves. We think that any mechanism that you get from opposition in itself is one that necessarily repeats the structural inequalities that led to the collapse. Before I go on to the second case, I'll take the POI.
Brown, you cannot be an comparative. On your side, you have minorities. On our side, we can have the comparative where we just have meritocratic.
It is comparative enough. It's comparative enough for me to say, amongst minorities as well, you have skilled workers. To be racist or to generally be discriminatory of you to say, in minority groups, you don't necessarily have diverse skills necessarily existing. If that was your debate, fix up. Continuing then on the second case, we believe that because beyond morality, because they will try to rest the entirety of their case on efficiency, we believe that you are more likely to survive, and this is a case that speaks to efficiency, not just on morality. You are more likely to survive if we go through this route. Why? Because we are more likely to get epistemic diversity within the purview of our world. Understand this case because this is critical. It will be a critical part of your way up. Oppressed minorities, by virtue of their adaptive collective survival under systemic adversity, possess unique, exclusive epistemic resources essential for humanity's survival on a new planet. The mechanism behind this is quite simple. Prioritization based on social and ecological resilience traits, things like indigenous groups, marginalized urban populations, refugee communities. These are individuals in themselves that have lived over time on scarce resources and in the ashes of environment over time and have been able to thrive and continually survive in and of themselves. We believe that this is not necessarily a case about pity, but necessarily prioritizing the adaptive expertise that exists amongst these individuals. The reason why this is key is because, in the first place, you have survival intelligence. Marginalized groups have developed sophisticated ecological knowledge, things like indigenous climate adaptation, things like communal resource management that outperforms industrial rationality in harsh environments. Because note that these environments are not exactly the kind of environment that existed in the world before. These are the ashes of the harshest environment. But two is that they have a social cohesion advantage. Why? Because they have developed solidarity, empathy, and cooperative decision making, crucial for sustaining a fragile pioneer society, something you won't necessarily have within the purview of the comparative, especially when you go with their word of meritocracy, where you bring people together that have not necessarily lived together over time. If you bring a doctor from this place, the best doctor from this place, the best engineer from this place, they've not necessarily had that social cohesion, which is equally necessary for the continued survival of social order within these particular spaces. But three is cognitive pluralism. These groups add epistemic diversity that prevents the narrow technocratic thinking that caused Earth's collapse in the first instance, things like over-extraction, ecological blindness. The comparative is where you have ops elite or technocratic prioritization. This reproduces the arrogance that destroyed the Earth in the first place, and their world dies again under the same model in itself. The last thing is that we believe that the greatest amount of power, especially in a new world, should be given to the weakest amount of, to the weakest people. That's why people are able to necessarily create this. This is a very crucial case, because notice that in and of itself, at worst, and this is the worst case scenario that can happen on either side, we can agree that humans in themselves are greedy, and because of the fact that these individuals are necessarily going to have access to these resources in the first instance, we necessarily give them great power. Why is it still better off than the comparative? The reason why it's still better off than the comparative is that even if they get access to these resources, first resources in themselves, they are minorities. What it means that they are minorities, it means that their numbers in themselves are not so large. So because their numbers in themselves are not so large, when other people come, they can necessarily be able to resist. If this first wave of government becomes oppressive, they are able to resist, and they are more likely to resist successfully because of the great asymmetry of numbers that favors these other individuals. The counterfactual is where you give those that already have so much power, you give them so much power. These oppressed individuals, when they come, they are not necessarily going to be able to effectively, revolt against these individuals. Therefore, it still creates the same oppressive structure. Our word is the fairest one, but beyond fairness, our word is the most effective. Votes opening governments.
All right, thank you very much to the Prime Minister. Now I welcome Leader of Opposition. Ready when you are.
My screen is acting up, and so if my network, can I have a minute to fix that?
Sure, you can. Okay, can you start your speech now, please? Leader of opposition, are you there? Okay, so I am going to start the disconnection timer now. Leader of deputy leader, please reach out to your partner. In the next 5 minutes, your partner should join. Otherwise, you might have to give the leader speech.
This connection is just 3 minutes. If it's 3 minutes, just like move on to the next speaker or have the
Okay,
DLO.
cool. DLO, can you give this PM leader of opposition speech? Then maybe by the time it's when it's time for the deputy speech, your partner's network should be stable by then, hopefully.
Yeah, but he is in the room, but like, let's hope, because that would probably mean I'm moving in that I share everything. Okay.
I can't
Just
hear
give
you
me a
clearly.
second. All right. I really hope you can both hear and see me.
Yes,
Give me a
yeah, audio
second.
are visible.
Okay, just give me a second.
Just a sec, just a sec. I don't know. Uh, uh, Henry is here. I think you can use. You come and don't complain. Come and do your shit. Disconnection first. That's right. Anyway, guys, like he's going to use my device for now. I think that's okay.
All right. Okay. It's a good thing.
Sorry for the delay. My network had a big issue. I want to confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you're.
Okay. This is a final. Been waiting 6 months for this, and yeah, we're finally here. Shout out to shout out to my support system, Peace Boy, Brian, Isaiah, Reen, my best friend of all time, James. Shout out to the Ugandan circuit once again. We've made it. Shout out to everybody who believed in me, and yeah, finalist again to everybody who didn't believe I could do it. I'm gonna start. If you have a POI, I will take it. I'm just gonna start my timer as soon as I am ready. On my next word. Scroll down. Sorry for the delay once again. I'm going to start on my first word now. Panel. I'm going to use an analogy of something that happened last week when these finals were supposed to happen on Sunday, but they ended up happening on Friday. In this specific scenario, I and James are the minority, and our case is going to base off that illustration through the round. Let's first start with the claim that comes from opening government. I want to first frame them out a bit. If you read the Infoslide closely, it talks about two specific things. The first is that these individuals aren't going to die. It means they are still going to be able to get all of humanity to go to that specific place. It simply means then that we are going to take them there at that specific planet, so everybody will be taken. It's just that it's in shifts and limited proportions. What does then this imply? The second piece of framing is that all the principal justifications opening government provides for reparative duty, and this is just taking them at their best case. We just don't think this is going to be our case on their side of the debate, is that at the end of the day, those individuals can still be taken. It means they can be taken in the third portion, in the fourth portion, in the second portion, if you think. This debate is about who gets there first, not who gets there. At that point, you genuinely think that the bulk of that chart becomes adequately irrelevant. The third thing here to say is on that aspect of survival skills. I'm going to engage that with what we think our chart is going to be. Our comparative is going to be simple. We are going to prioritize meritocracy. If you don't buy this, I'm going to give you a simple example to buy into this. Singapore. When Singapore had limited resources, they were able to generate and prioritize these things to the more meritable individuals. They had a system to evaluate who was more meritable and who wasn't. If the question about this debate is going to be on who is more meritable, I think we can still co-opt and still fiat, because opening government fiat, they have a system to determine the oppressed groups. We can fiat a system to determine who at the end of the day most likely becomes a meritable individual on merit. Merit is not just about brains. There is merit in strength. There is merit in who you are. There is merit in beauty. There is merit in you being able to do hardcore jobs. There is merit in your intelligence. We have a system that will proportionally distribute all the meritable individuals and will actively determine what specific people get to be sent there. Meritable individuals that will be used to now re-establish the world order, but also re-establish and regrow the specific scenario. Why is this actively better than these guys, right? First of all, it simply means that we're going to have more time invested in that particular regard. It means we're going to have more time to be able to heal, to be able to like sort all those specific issues. We're going to have more time to ensure that those specific problems are fixed in that particular regard. What it actively means then that our people are more productive and will be more coordinated, but also thirdly, will be more ethical in nature because it is mostly on professionalism. People who function on merit want to be the best version of themselves and understand what it means to probably strive. So they understand and can relate with their individuals far more better to become more productive. I think that the comparative is clear on our side. I'll take a POI from closing government. Yeah. Okay, so I think closing government hasn't yet gotten a POI. So the idea then becomes very simple.
I had one. Do you still want to take?
Hurry, man.
Yeah, sure. So on your side of the world, you need to show us how maintaining the old world can have any future for righting the wrongs that minorities have been facing. Just do that when you're beating OG.
Yeah, and I'm beating OG and you guys because I know that's going to be the bulk of your whip speech, Nana. The idea here is very simple, and this is our first argument. You create the same old world when you invite minorities. The illustration is going to be here, and here's the flip. When every time you get minority individuals, right? And this was the scenario last week. Whenever the majority determine what the norm has to be, it means the minority get oppressed. James has to do these finals very stressed and very exhausted from an examination paper. I have to do this. I have to now get a border to now go into the cold and put my asthma and sinuses at the verge of extinction because at the end of the day, we were put in this position. When we get the opportunity next time to determine when the final gets to be had, we are more petty. We are more self-centered to ensure that we do things to fit ourselves because we believe we have been robbed and we're going to take away our specific time. We become more biased and have more animosity in that particular regard. It means you create a more biased world on their side. Remember, they consider the people who go first get to dictate these resources. They are limited. In and of itself, it means suffering becomes far worse on our side. We think on our side of the debate, we say these specific limitations is what make us human. They make us understand what we need to do to make the world a better place. These guys can't say that minorities understand those things better. Why do the people who actively go first become better on our side? We say we get more rational individuals to now dictate how those specific things function. Because we now use meritocracy, which involves all people from all walks of life. Because there are people who are gay but have merit. There are people who are probably majority or who are white but have merit. There are black people with merit. There are Hispanic people with merit. You create a society that is more considerate, but secondly, more about productivity than about the existential biases. On our world, we create create a world, a clean slate, which is the advocacy for why we ought to prioritize this. We say that in the event that now you are in a new geographical location, all that ranting about from opening and closing that is going to be about the principal justifications cease to exist. You are in a new time. You are in a new geographical mainframe. People are now having a different mindset. The mindset is actively about survival. On this side of the debate, it then means then that there's going to be more hoarding of resources, more inhabitation that makes the world more chaotic but less productive for individuals. Why does our case win and why is our side more productive? Because they are more, and this is the idea. It's about prioritization on who goes first. It means when you prioritize our individuals, the merit people with meritocracy, you make the planet more habitable because they are meritable and they put a lot of time in merit. They are more self-actualized than the lot. They are more knowledgeable. They are stronger, but they're actively better. Unless these guys want to assume on opening government and closing government that minority groups in of themselves, there are individuals who are meritable. The people who are minorities, and we feel for them. You are oppressed, yes. You are treated by a racist person in Texas a very good time back, but you are unable to contribute to the society because you are lazy. You are weak. We say that in that particular regard, let the people going first prepare a world where you can actively become more comfortable. The reason why the society evolves is that individuals who self-actualize and create more merit are the ones that probably go there. On that side of the debate, you motivate more individuals to now seek merit and not call their grandfathers to put them on the special to take them first. We saw on our side of the debate, you create a metric for meritocracy where you get more productive individuals, but for those who have chosen not to be, are forced to become more productive to get there first. It actively means then that all the skills they have acquired are actively going to exponentially exist. Before closing operation comes and says that they are logically prior, you need to understand that the team that wins the debate is the biggest impact. One thing, firstly, is that we're able to exacerbate the rate of development to make the world more habitable for the rest of the batch that is coming. Secondly, we're able to rewrite the wrongs of history and create a more meritable centric world, and people are able to let go of their biases. You now create a world that probably has that has less of the biases that have existed in that particular regard. On our side, our case is simple. We have made mistakes in the past. It is time to write and make that slate clean to change the world. We are proud to win from opening opposition.
All right, thank you very much. Now I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Ready when you are.
Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, great. So good evening, everyone on the call. I'll be the DPM for the round. If you want to ask a POI, just unmute once and be specific on the role. So POI opening or POI seal. Let me set up a timer and then I can start. And do I have a timer here? Sorry, give me a sec. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so let me set this first. Okay. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, just give me a sec. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, there are 3 things you need to realize. The first is that when there is the prioritization of sending oppressed minorities to a new inhabitable planet, it doesn't ultimately mean that we send dummies or individuals that don't have epistemic access to intelligence or the ability to sustain themselves at a point where they penetrate the new planet. Because what these guys fail to understand on their own side is that aeronautical engineering or the idea of you populating within a new planet in most instances require you having access to skills, but secondly, require you having access to intelligence to know what the wildlife, what the air looks like, what the resources looks like, because that's the only way you can ultimately utilize all of those resources, which means implicitly, by virtue of the sending, you require access to intelligence for you to access, like being an oppressed minority that gets access to this in those sort of instances, which means this funny case about meritocracy literally has no value within the debate insofar as by virtue of the motion, it requires you having access to like just skills and talent for you to access it in the first instance. But I think the first thing I'm going to do is to give you an extension that directly engages with opening up. I think the principle here is that in an instance when you want to take an action that requires the protection of human life and for the existence of survival, what is the most important moral principle? I think the reason why humans probably, given that we don't have epistemic access to why the motion exists, I think given that humans consistently over time want to migrate to other planets, the reason why they ultimately want to do that is either because they want to project their knowledge and their intelligence, but secondly, there is this consistent fear that the Earth is probably going to decay and we are going to be like incapable to live within the Earth. Which means then, in principle, when you have a disaster scenario and you want to have the migration of individuals, the most important ethical principle is to make sure that individuals that are most vulnerable in the world that is decaying and in the world that is suffering and is in a world of disaster are individuals that get to go first. And I think the reason why this is more proximate to the round is because you can understand the way this looks like within status quo. So there are individuals that are facing existential threats like, due to things like persecution or due to things like poverty or state-sanctioned violence. And I think the reason why this is morally significant is because the existence of state a priori is to ensure that individuals get epistemic access to resources or the ability to get access to happiness. The problem right now in status quo or even on their own side of the house is that state sanctions violence either through means of gerrymandering or the inability to give you certain utilities because they feel that certain ethnicities or certain tribes have like more epistemic access to happiness. This is the situation that exists in most countries like the United States, which means on our own side of the house, the only way we fulfill that moral prerogative that exists a priori by the foundation of state is literally on our own side of the house. But I think evacuation requires individuals that faces the severity of of a threat or the problem to get the access to more levels of happiness. I think the second thing I'm going to engage, and this is an extension, is that their case is ultimately contingent on the analysis that when individuals migrate, they are probably going to have terrible notions that probably start oppressing individuals more. I think there are two extensions to respond to this material. The first thing that you have to understand here is that when new individuals migrate to a place, they ultimately set the cultural norms and the political system and the social contracts that ultimately guide their new place. When you send oppressed minorities, yeah, it means that you have not just black individuals, you have Latinos, you have Asians, you have Hispanics, continentals, which means that you have the existence of diverse perspectives. But secondly, it means that all of these diverse perspectives like ultimately conglomerate to form an existing government, which means three things. The first is that it is inclusive, which means that the ability for you to get the integration of different perspectives materializes on our own side of the house. But secondly, it's ultimately more empathetic and it's more durable insofar it is a reflection of ultimately people's preferences and not a reflection of preferences of individuals that are ultimately powerful. What they need to defend on their own side of the house is that what they need to defend on their own side of the house is individuals that have epistemic access to capital or probably have access to better education by virtue of things like lottery of birth or because state ultimately gives them more resources. It means at that particular point, they are less likely going to understand the struggles of individuals that exist within the grassroots. But the problem here is that at a point where you want to migrate to a new place, the reason why you a priori did that is because individuals are suffering, which means that the only way you get access to the best form of government is a government that is ultimately inclusive and empathetic to the sufferings of individuals in the past world. But I think the next thing I'm going to analyze here is why this will probably create a safer, more stable society within the context of the debate. But before that, is there any PR?
Yeah, like why would the minorities be bad people?
Okay.
Henry already gives you an idea.
Why is it going to be probably like more safer and more durable? I think the first thing here is that when you have migration of not minorities, individuals that have access to capital. I think the way capital propagates itself right now in status quo is that it's based on the system of exclusion. So you have the existence of things like intellectual property rights that ultimately give people more access to capital or probably give them the control or the monopoly to ultimately produce goods, which means that you have the mass migration of these sets of individuals first. Two things manifest. The first is that they literally take control of all of those resources. And I think like aeronautical and space exploration ultimately requires you to like venture into planets or migrate into planets that have the resources to essentially sustain you and individuals at that particular point. Which means that when these individuals that have access to capital migrate first, it means that they ultimately take control of the resources that exist within this new planet. But secondly, is that it's literally based on a system of
POI.
like it's pastime. It's literally based on a system of competition, which means that when they take control of it, they ultimately compete with state and state-regulated institutions at that particular point, which means that you give them the power to do things like decouple the state and decouple the extent to which states can have access and control over this new planet. I think the reason why you inherently have to buy this principle is that this already exists within status quo when they do things like state-sponsored campaigns for certain political aspirants or through the mechanism of the revolving door policy, which ultimately means that they are going to have the manifestation of state like controlled like institutions by capitalists on their own side of the house when you have the migration of individuals that have more access to capital. The only way you can democratize intelligence, the only way you can democratize resources is when individuals that control those resources know what the sufferings looks like in the past and they are less likely going to repeat it in the future. For all of these reasons, OG.
Thank you very much to Deputy Prime Minister. Now I welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. Ready when you are.
Hi. Can you
Wait,
see me?
Chair, the Zoom chat space was interrupted. So maybe could like James look at Isaiah's DM real quick.
All right. Hi, Pano. Can you both see and hear me?
Yes, I.
All right. Just give me a second. I just glance at the motion one more time. Okay. I'm gonna start this. Oh, just before I start the speech. Yeah, shout out to Henry. Shout out to I don't know, like the one to be paid for this tournament. We didn't have the money at that time, so like yeah, it is God I said. Shout out to like the big cranes, shout out to like all my friends, my family. Yeah, it's really basic stuff, but yeah. And shout out to anyone else I've forgotten. I'm really sorry, it was never malicious. Okay. I'm gonna start the speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Hano, I really need you to disregard the specific part of what like DPM says. The comparative isn't where you send wealthy people. This is where they get the comparative wrong. The comparative is the one that Henry gives you, the meritocracy, where you pick the best people who have the capability to fulfill these roles, where you pick the best individuals who have had long-term access to resources and have experience, collective experience to be able to thrive in this place. There are two key things that like OG misses, and hopefully CG does this. This debate isn't just about taking them there. They are limited resources. That creates an interesting delta because note, club teams had to explain to us why that is likely, why you are much more likely going to use these resources to be like, why they're much more likely going to utilize these resources and make them good. And the second thing, I think the third thing that's important here to say is that the problem on their side when you assume that people who have capital is the comparative, like the fact the world is ending, but like you can presume that like rich people are probably still doing well, right? Like you know, like rich people are probably still doing well, so that the comparative wouldn't make sense in their world. But a couple of responses here. First, I really don't think minorities require like special treatment. I think minorities one that is good for them. The other most important comparative I want to say here is that that POI from CG is a lie. The comparative right now isn't a meritocracy. Is where you have people who are wealthy individuals ruling the places. That's not the comparative. So when you're making a comparative panel, it's a comparative where you have a meritocracy. Because I want to note that we're going to a new world, new place. You get to actually create the society that you want to see. A society which is much more inclusive, a society where people are not meant to feel that they are bad. A society where people are not meant to feel that, oh, I'm bad because I'm black, but a society which is like ultimately good and diverse. So note this panel. The comparative from CG is a lie. The comparative have a meritocracy. Only meritocracy which exists is Singapore, and like Henry, I think examples to say this, but like I'll develop it more as I go on. The first thing here they say, PM says that, oh, you're much more likely going to have a small population and they won't utilize the resources. A couple of responses. I think this is untrue because I think this ignores the fact that there's a long duration through which you're going to go and pick other people. That's to say, rather than to utilize the resources, you require people who are going to multiply those resources. Because when you bring another group of people, they now all are going to use them like it doesn't make sense. You need people who are going to grow those resources because they are limited. I don't remember that. They're limited. And the second thing here, this assumes that consumption is linear to the population size. This is largely untrue. Why? Because if you look at current societies, they consume a lot. They consume a lot. Look at the American society, they consume a lot. This is to say there's been an increase in consumption for people. But most importantly, pardon, don't forget the analysis Henry gives you as to how one, like you're going to have a perverse incentive to like benefit yourself, and when he uses that whole analogy about like us not being able to debate last weekend, I think he's right. One, human beings are inherently selfish. So, pardon, the point at which you weigh that response, you have to weigh all this. The second thing is that they say you must give power to the weakest. Pardon, I think this is far, far much more worse. Why? People who are weak are much, much more vengeful because they have gone through the disadvantages that happen at the bottom. This is why you could only have a person like Nelson Mandela say, let's come together, let's have like reconciliation. Why? Because the comparative of someone who has been down there, who has been facing apartheid very, very harshly, and I'm not trying to say that like we did face apartheid, but the moment, what I'm trying to explain to you, that the proximity here is quite important. Because what? You have to defend a world where you take minorities, like minorities. We're not talking about like we're looking at the minorities, right? And the comparative is where we take like meritocracies. I think the third response I want to give here is that they say all minorities have more skilled people. People things. Even if this is true, I think they are few at best. Why is quantity important? The fact that you're going to a new planet and you're going to have new explorations necessitates that you have to have a large amount of individuals. Why? This is true because when you're wanting to cultivate something, you need to put in a lot of force. So comparatively speaking, panel, the comparative like OG country like, oh, we also have skilled people. And it's kind of 1 to 10. You're much more likely going to have like 2 or 3% skilled people. The comparative is we take 9% or 10% of people who are meritocracy, who are good people, are going to, and we think that that's like a little bit much better world because not, you are much more able going to utilize the resources and prepare the boundaries for other people. Sadly, the problem here is that like one, minorities have suffered because of structural disadvantages. And those structural disadvantages things that you have to actively work throughout the system. The important thing I want to do here now is why you are much more likely going to have success when you send people who are married, who are part of merit. See this illustration I want you to remember in the liberation is illustration of what is currently happening in America. What institutions of education are largely left wing at this point in time. This is true because we see the strongest conservative people, like the Republicans, like Donald Trump, actively trying to suppress them. This is true, Kano, because in most instances, left wing, also in most instances, academic institutions work on a meritocracy system where if you're good, you get that job. This is to say, throughout time, they have a much more progressive views. These progressive views guarantee what? They guarantee you to have a much more diverse society. This is to say, I think the impact is on our side if you're much more likely going to send people who are based on merit. I think you're much more likely going to get a diverse society because I think the people who are going to get are people from universities, are people who are from academia, and the trend has been that they are much more progressive in current society. I'll take a few from CG. 3, 2, 1, go. OG. 3, 2, 1, go. All right. The second thing I really want to explain here is that why are you much more likely going to get a diverse, and why are you going to much more likely going to be able to utilize the resources? I want to do the comparative. That even if you believe them that on their side they have much like skilled people, the skilled people we have on our side are much more long-term experienced people. Why? Because a lot of them have had access to these resources. I need you to the fact that you have had more experience and more experience living now in the meritocracy means that you are much more likely going to make sure that the structures you receive there are much better. Kano, a couple of considerations when you're in deliberation. The first is that this is a new world that we get to create. We get to set the precedent. We get to decide how society runs. When you pick people who are much more when you pick people based on meritocracy, the current meritocracy that we have is tied to intellectualism, and intellectualism is much more left-wing, is much more progressive. This is why you have literally even Harvard switching its system to ensure that it gets much more diverse array of individuals. The part of the comparative that on their side, you give minorities sympathy. Minorities don't want sympathy. They want a world where they are cared for. They want a world where no one looks at them as they are being bad. We get that, or all gets that in two specific ways. We tell you they're much more likely going to be vengeful because they have to defend the comparative of people who have been much more proximate to that racism, proximate to those harms. The comparative is we pick a meritocracy. If you believe in this, pick us, right?
All right, thank you very much to the deputy leader of deputy leader of opposition. That brings us to the end of the opening half. Now I welcome member of government. Ready when you are.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Oh, nice. Let me just
Did
I
you
can
see your
also
DMs?
hear me. Soups, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I want to know if you saw your DMs.
Let me quickly check that. Okay. Yeah, so for POIs from my third or fourth minute, please give me just a minute to set up my timer and I'll begin. Okay. For POIs from my third or fourth minute, I think sorry, I'm actually at work using the same device. That's the reason why there seems to be that clash and me looking over my shoulder. So forgive me a bit. Um, okay. So from my third or fourth minute, you can just say POI and then I'll take it from there. Beyond that, I think I'm still audible, so I'll begin on my next word. Okay, so shout out to me and shout out to Super Nana, starting then in 3, 2, and 1. The conversation around meritocracy, especially with this being a final, is one that we need to be very careful about. And you know why? Because naturally it sounds very intuitively appealing, but if you pay close attention to it and tie it directly to the info slide and this motion, you'd realize that it becomes structurally and morally flawed. And I'm going to be giving you this on 2 levels to show you why OO is out of this debate. And this allows us to beat OG at least one on the level of responses that you get to OO's claim. The very first one is when you look at the concept of meritocracy on a very philosophical level, it's never morally neutral. Because ask yourself, how do we create the concept or the idea of meritocracy? And we assume that, well, it can be, that's OO, assume that it can be fairly identified, it can be rewarded. But the truth of the matter is that meritocracy is something that has always been socially constructed by power. So, for example, what we call merit within a particular system or society is always defined by people who have already benefited from that privilege. So, people who have access to education, technology, language, and opportunity. These are the people who define what merit is, which is applied within the context of OO. These people who are considered the most qualified people to survive, like the scientists, the engineers, the doctors, they are overwhelmingly drawn from classes and people that had the resources to cultivate these skills. So when OO says that they want to send the most meritorious groups of people, what they are actually saying is that they want to preserve the same social order that created the inequality within the first place. What that tells you is that that system of meritocracy preserves the illusion of fairness, when in fact they continue to cement that historical advantage that people get. So if the new world would just be built on that unequal design, you make that mistake and allow these people with privileges to still win from there. But let's draw a bit back into history, because all the argumentation you get on the concept of meritocracy assumes on a general and normative level that it's a good thing. Because you need to understand here that the very concept of meritocracy that is preached by OO, and you also need to pay attention to the fact that we are constructing a new world. What should be most important to the panel is how it most likely would translate and how society's moral order would be decided. That means that you need to ask yourself what meritocracy means to people and how it is used in reality. We say that meritocracy has always been used as a language of oppression. And here's the truth. We always use meritocracy within human context. Every form of society, look at history, it's been used as a form of rationalization of exclusion of a group of people. So, for example, look at the colonial powers when they assumed that they were more civilized and therefore they were most likely the more meritorious people. What they did with that narrative was to justify the domination of other people. But you see, move away from the colonialists, the capitalist elites. They argue that the rich people deserve to rule because they were more competent. That's meritocracy. Look at patriarchal systems. They excluded women and minorities from leadership because they simply said they lacked merit. It means that the very rhetoric of meritocracy always arises after there's some structural violence. And what you do is that you begin to sanitize that inequality because you call it the outcome of individual efforts. The very last restructuring I'm going to do to prove to you that every single concept of meritocracy should not win this final is the very context that produces ability. And panel, note this. Let's assume that OO is right, that we can objectively measure their skill or even their contribution potential. Here's why they'll still not win, because that's an extreme level I'm pushing this debate in. You need to understand that those abilities only exist because of structural opportunity, not the inherent worth of people to say they can give or there are some people who are worth it. There's a mechanism to prove that. If you have a child that is born into poverty, and they probably could have become the next Einstein if they had access to the same nutrition, the stability, and the education that Einstein had. A woman that is born within a war-torn region, a patriarchal region, she may never get the institutional pathway to prove her intelligence. What that tells you that the very concept and build-up of the society of OO, meritocracy, is one that is flawed. Sorry if I'm losing my voice at some point. I actually have a very terrible headache and I'm not too well. That gives you a complete restructuring of this debate that OG doesn't give you. We beat them on that level. But here's where we think you even need to assess this debate from a more deeper perspective to win us this finals. Because the conversation is not really about the reparation that we give these people. It's about how we reconstruct the world. It's not really about who gets to live in that world. It's about what kind of world do we build for others to live in. And here's where I'm going to be proving to you on a very designed level of moral choice. You need to understand here, first of all, panel, and here's the winning extension. The first question you need to ask yourself to even ascertain who gets to control the first level of resources in that state is how the old world died. We say the old world died because of moral failure. And you see, before there was any form of flood, before whatever it is that the Infoslide tells about, like all those things that allow the world to collapse, we think things like climate change, resource depletion, for which the world would most likely collapse, it's hypothetical. But we think these things are symptoms. What really caused the collapse of the world was human hierarchy. The persistent belief that some lives were worth more than others. And look at the thing very simply from all my Infoslide and analysis earlier. Colonialism is extracted from the global south. Patriarchy was silencing women. Racism structured that global world. It means that the moral architecture, which is the idea that domination, exploitation were normal, is what poisoned our systems of cooperation. It's what poisoned our distribution of resources. And it's what ultimately led to our ability to survive as species. It means that if we begin to rebuild humanity without building that moral foundation, we are getting towards the same outcome. And that's why Sulemana and myself are saying the existing structure of meritocracy from OO, built on this same premise of moral framework that exists within what collapsed the first system, is what you most likely would get when you move these individuals into that world. That's why we win. It's 6-17 on my end. Unfortunately, I can't take you. It's not my fault. But here's the mechanism, because we say we send these people to build the world. And it's quite clear already that whoever goes first is the one who gets to set the template for these institutions, the culture, the moral grammar of society. And here's what we say. If the privileged get to go, the majority, it means that those who have always been at the top, like OG says, they get to recreate what they know. And here's where we push it even further. It means that you get a more globalized system of hierarchies being built, extraction, and even exclusion. That tells you that they are literally carrying this away with them. And it's not any unique extension. This is simply what happens in history. And that's what we think the danger becomes. It means that you don't build a sentimental society. You create some sociological danger within those spaces, and we think it's dangerous. And panel, here's why we even win on the end. We don't think this is reverse oppression because we are not just reversing it. It's not revenge, it's redesign. Because we are not punishing the privilege, we are protecting the future. And here's why it means so. Because survival within our state means solidarity. And even today, we see it happen. African countries prioritizing stewardship over profit. LGBT societies preaching inclusion. This is how we grow, and this is how we build a world that stands. Vote CG.
All right, thank you very much to the member of government. Now I welcome member of opposition. Ready when you are. Is the member of opposition on this call?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? I'm at work, so give me a few seconds. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes,
Can any of you hear me? All right, great. So for PO, just unmute yourself around my 5th minute, and then you ask yourself, you ask the POI. If I don't take you, don't worry. Dennis will engage you so that we have a very good final. I'm just assuming that my voice is still good. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Here is why none of the teams, even till CG, will win the debate. And let me start with CG. The reason why CG loses the debate is that their own historical analysis tells us that humanity collapsed because of hierarchies. But the very metric on which they are prioritizing someone to go before the other is based on a hierarchy. So you are a lower class, so go first. That in of itself is a hierarchy. So if hierarchies collapse the existing society and you are trying to create a new world based on a hierarchy, then per the extrapolation of your own logic, that society is going to collapse and your benefit does not accrue. That is why CG loses the debate. But let's come to opening government. I think they have this weird assumption that when minorities are able to go to those places, all the things like oppression, all those other things are going to leave. They don't mechanize that side of the house because if they now have the structural capacity, they have every other thing. The other people that will come will still become minorities. All the inequalities, all the other things that you claim on your side of the house will compound because it's just a sector of people, probably on ethnic lines or probably on gender lines, that are controlling the capacity, and another like entrance into that new world does not control that capacity. So your inequality, all the other things that you claim on your side, still happen. So at best, their word is a problem solution mismatch. It solves nothing in the debate. Open opposition says meritocracy. The problem with meritocracy is that it's just a set of people that get to have that merit, like closing government says, for them to go, which compounds the same inequality that is compounded within opening government world and closing government world. So at best, the three of them do not solve any equality on their side of the house. Notice this is framed as a normative debate. So the only sensible thing that should have come in the heads of these people is that if we don't let one class go, then we are probably going to institute a quota system where there is an assumption within the debate as a normative that we can sample people from different diverse regions such that every single person gets represented. So even if it's one person in that quota that gets represented from diverse perspectives and all those other stuff, in order for us to get a set of people that can go, that representation and that quota system is better within that side of the house. Why do we think this is a sensible moral ground? 3 levels, because it keeps the moral redress without creating a monopoly. Why is this uniquely important? Because that means that insofar as at least one person from any other group gets represented, that new capital that is in the other world, they get to have a share within that capital. This could be passed on through things like inheritances, all those other stuff when the next wave comes. So if a white person is passing that capacity to another person, a black person also had that first mover advantage and is passing on into other, which means that we decrease the extent at which we are able to create disparities between people in terms of capacity, such that we are able to collapse the inequality gap that exists within most of these people, decrease the power asymmetry within people, which does not create the inequality that all of them care about. That is the only way that minorities are able to get sustaining reparation within that side of the house. But secondly, everyone is able to create a fairly egalitarian society where a lot of people are able to protect themselves within that instance, because we collapse what gives people power asymmetry to monopolize against people. So if the case is about who is able to solve inequality within this debate, we win. But again, this is a policy motion. You need to justify why, in principle, this is something that's supposed to be done. Opening government principle is that there is lottery of birth, all those other stuff. But yeah, lottery of birth also made people like wealthy. So why is lottery of birth fundamentally faulty? There is no analysis that goes beyond that. It's just like a rhetorical gimmick that they want to play to win this debate. But why is our principle winning this debate? Our principle is simple. Individuals do not have any moral superiority over the other. So every individual in society, regardless of whether they are from they are from or any other wherever they are from, possess equal moral worth, and it is impossible for any individual to adjudicate between them in terms of moral worth, insofar as we lack epistemic access to these individuals' preferences, and thus lack the way to adjudicate between them. Insofar as this is true, and we cannot determine with an object what the most morally valuable ideology identity is, a moderate environment where you are able to sample every single person to get represented within most of these newer lands is the only way where we are able to approximate a certain form of centrism and a certain form of egalitarianism for these people. Why is this important? Because structurally, it proves that if all human beings have the same equal moral worth, it's on our side of the house that we are able to fulfill that moral worth by respecting their dignity and giving them a chance in order for them to have that capacity to enjoy themselves. Why is this particularly important? Because this proves that for the very inequality, hierarchy, all those other things that closing government preaches, they are based off power asymmetry, which we collapse on our side of the house. Whether you merit it or not, there is a quota that exists on that side of the house. So we can still get brilliant people who are blacks, brilliant people who are white, who can still form within that quota and go there. We still build that environment on that side of the house. We still make sure that they still get that advantage and no one gets advantage over the other. It's only on our side from closing and gap and from closing up that we are able to solve this uniquely to benefit the minorities and everything they claim on their side. Aristotle, shoot your POI.
Okay. The idea here is that if it's on the basis of skills, it means that there is a replication of people that have access to capital, which means my last principle.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. You don't listen to the very first minute of my speech. Wealth and capacity is something that compounds over time, and these are things that are passed on through lineages all over time. So you can't win on skill because most of Infoslide tells you that they are coming in batches. So maybe after the next 2 years or maybe 3 years, when the next batch will come, I would have compounded that wealth and I can pass it on to the people that identify with my identity. But what makes this unique is that every identity is represented within this quota, and motion fiat that we can be able to do it. That means that even if that inequality is or that wealth is passed on from generation to other, we get your skill that you want to get on your side of the house, but we decrease the asymmetry that mostly exists within people. What exists on your comparative is that most of the minorities that will exist there will monopolize the power. When the newer people come, they don't pass it to them because they don't identify with them. So you create that structural inequality, that structural gap, and you create the very same system that you want to create, avoid on your side, because the newer people that come there now become the very minorities that you claim need to be protected, and all those other things that you claim on your side of the house. You don't get any skill, you don't get anything. But even on skill, we are able to prove to you have a much more sustainable world. We have a much more egalitarian world, and the very minorities and the human dignity of the very people that we want to protect is something that we do better on your side. We smartly win this debate because we collapse closing government's hierarchy that they want to collapse. Because when they say poor people or minorities should go and the others should come later, they create that same hierarchy that exists on their side of the house. But secondly, the logic of their allocation itself
No.
based on a hierarchy which they say they don't like. On all fronts, you need to vote for closing up.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I welcome the government whip speaker. Ready when you are.
Hi guys, am I audible? Can you hear me? Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool, fantastic. Right, yes, hold on. Whoa, okay, Jonathan, I see at the end. Yeah, cool. Hi everyone. Check it out. Check out my username and be sure to visit Vacation Spas. Yeah, we're working on something fantastic for the community. So also shout outs to Aiden. Yeah, hopefully we're gonna win this one. Make you proud. If you have a POI though, or wait, let me see if I can see the chat space. No, I can't see the chat space. So if you have a POI, unmute. Yep, unmute and let me later on in the speech. Cool, time to start. I'm gonna start my debate in 3, 2, 1. The light from closing the position falls apart when you realize the responses I'm about to give to you. Because number one, they say that because we are the most relevant team, they need to engage with our argument about hierarchies, right? Fuck it. Sorry. Let me restart. Like the timer isn't working. Cool. Timer working. I'm gonna restart in 3, 2, 1. Look, closing up says we are the most relevant team. So what do they do in response to Jonathan's extensions? They only say a one-liner. Well, hierarchies are symmetric in both sides. So if you're saying minorities first, then you're using some kind of hierarchy. So like if A, then B, CG loses. That's a very basic response. It doesn't respond to the nuance at all. I don't think the average intelligent voter is going to buy this. Here is why. Because Jonathan's argument on hierarchy was 2 minutes. He told you that the hierarchy that contributed to the moral failure was because it was being abused, because it was built on things like power and domination and race and class. That meant that the people at the bottom get to suffer whilst those at the top were benefiting and imposing those benefits or like those harms that were due to them onto those that were below them. That meant that the hierarchy was unfair, and that was a failure of the hierarchical system that existed in the whole, like in the old world. Therefore, if we move the minorities into the world that is like new now, what we are doing is that we're giving them a chance to recuperate from the harms that the old hierarchy inflicted upon them. A rebuttal to this cannot be that you taking the minorities first is you prioritizing them based off of a hierarchy. So it's the same thing. I think the whip needs to prove that taking the minorities there in the first place is contributing an equal proportionate harm that those majorities on the old world have done over centuries and a millennia to that minority. That's the only point you can equate those two hierarchies and say, well, then it's also a hierarchy with abuse of power and classism and moral failure. Like that's the only chart of rebuttal you can have. You can't simply say the hierarchy is the same way and move away. But in fact, it's not. The other two extensions from CEO is then to say, well, then number one, the annual alternative is to say that quotas are going to be allocated to each class and race of people in the world. And that means then that when the minorities go along with the majority and everybody else, they are going to find a way to make themselves sustaining. This sounds nice, but it doesn't work in practice. Here is why. Because number one, we think that when the minorities go, right, the majority that are left behind in this old world can find ways and means to like survive before they get to move ahead. Being a majority and being dominant over exploiting resources means you have access to things like bankers to keep yourself safe and to like collaborate with other people and get yourself existing before the next batch is due to your turn. But then there is a harm when the quota system CEO proposes leaves about 50% of that minority behind waiting for the next batch. Those minorities will probably die out before the next batch is due because of things like they are facing famine, hunger, lack of access to employment. Nobody likes them because you can't do anything for me if you're a minority. Why would I help you? Because of the transactional nature of people and how they are selling out to their own friends. That same moral failure Jonathan tells you, that means CO has to defend why we need to choose a quota system that will take 20% of like gay people, 20% of black people, 20% of white people, this percentage of like the oppressors and the billionaires, this percentage of millionaires, this percentage of Amazon corporation guy. Like it's a world that would ensure that by the time you go, when you come back, the minorities would be dead, the billionaires, the trillionaires, the corporation owners, the CEOs are going to be existent. That means that your quota system is contributing to that harm even tenfold. Then why is it on principle? Because I'm not responding. Later. I'm responding to the extension that CEO gives you that says everybody has equal moral worth. Therefore, you cannot choose on any metric why somebody deserves aid. I don't think this is true. The fact that we have equal moral worth means then that when we are hurt and you are like solving a dilemma facing the human race and the species, you need to prioritize the people that need the help the most. This is true because that is why in hospitals, we save those at the highest risk. We save those in the emergency rooms first before you save those with like a broken hand. That's why number two, when we have things like affirmative actions, we give access to those that are historically excluded. That's why again, number three, when we are doing this like refugee settlement, we prioritize the most endangered like children, like women, before we consider the men, and we probably enlist those men in the armies. That means the existence of human species and the like period of threatens, like period where we are threatened, like this very one in this debate, is one that says that given that we are all of equal moral worth, we need to make sure that the people who have had their moral worth reduced by the most get replenished to the same equal level first. Because if Blacks and gays and Hispanics are down to 5% of their moral worth, you need to make sure you send them first so they can replenish that moral worth to the same 80 to 100% that the whites and the majorities are. We beat you on their same principle. They're losing out. The whip has a shit ton of job to do, but they can't do better than me. Oh, shoot. What's your PY?
So, in your world, do you prefer to leave someone on the planet who has an IQ of 200 and take a black person who is lazy, boring, and has no production in the world just because they are a minority and they've been oppressed for a very long time? Who should go first and who should be better priced to make the world a better place?
No, this is fine. This is fine. It's an okay POI. I wouldn't say it's racist. I'm just saying that within minority communities, there are people with 200 IQ, right? So what your meritocracy would do is that if you can only take like 5,000 people, you are likely to get all the 5,000, the majority people, because they've had access to years and years of resources that make sure they've got the best education. That's how unfair it is. So on our side of the world, you can equally get minority people who have an IQ of 2,000, because like evidence has shown that like LeBron James, like Serena Williams, and like all of these brilliant black people are people that can make sure that they also prove their worth. But how do I like respond again to that POI? The idea is when you take them to a new enabling environment, that lazy black person that was deemed structurally lazy because they didn't have access to jobs and access to schools and access to those sports and scholarship, would get into a new world where they need to build a civilization. That means by default, there would be jobs for everyone to do. You need to probably go work in the solar mines to make sure that we are powering the civilization. You need to make sure you are working on the aqua farm to make sure we are getting like fish and meat processing to come around. That means jobs are going to be there. So even if Owo deems you a lazy black person, the new nature of the world would make sure sure that you can't afford to be lazy, you will be there, and those checks and balances will be there. I don't think that POI saves your case. It doesn't. But we are going to do something OG doesn't do, because we tell you that when you take these minorities there, you are more likely to have them to build the world in a good way, that when these majorities come, they cannot flip it over. To be fair, OG tells you that this would happen because when they go first, they get first mover advantages, they set constitutions, but they don't tell you why those constitutions are likely going to be fair. Jonathan does this because he tells you that the human race needs some level of cooperation and empathy, and that is most dominantly seen in minority communities. This is true because of things like, number one, they have a shared sense of suffering. That means they are more likely to be communal. That means in those new world, for example, the corporate laws they are going to set is one that wouldn't reward capitalists so much, or probably reward people that do things and companies that are built on social levels and social trust and benefits people like or socially. That means even if the majority comes, that is the norm they have to fall in line with. Your billionaires cannot come and then upset that new world. It means we are prior to OG because we show you how the constitutions they say would be made would be one that benefits everybody socially and communally, repairs the spirit that the human race needs to make sure that the species that thrives. Vote CG.
Okay, thank you very much to the government whip speaker. Now I welcome the opposition whip speaker to round up this entire debate.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. All right. So kindly give me like 30 seconds. Let me set up myself. Okay then. So hello everyone. If you have a POI, kindly unmute and ask. I'll be willing to. I want one from open government actually. So, if you have a POI, kindly unmute and ask. All right. So let me set up my timer then. After that, I'll begin. Okay. So then, I'm going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Notice that their case on empathy and all assumes that if people get capital, they still remain the same. Black people who became rich never cared about Black communities. We think that we have seen this. No. What we do on our side is that we create a far more equitable distribution on that particular side because we help most of these communities to advance. I'm going to do this. But then before I get into that, right, I think closing government like has a lot of funny responses to the case that Eziel gives you. Because the reason why they say that this quota system would be ineffective is because like the wealth in itself is something that is transactional in nature, which means that when they go there, the bigger people are going to necessarily bully the minorities and still maintain wealth, power, and dominance. We think that this logic is weird and funny because this is a new world where everybody gets an equal access to these resources from ground zero. If rich people can import their riches, their connections and stuff like that, then we won't even be having this debate because we know that they will just bring those riches and still dominate in the first place, which then means then opening government or closing government wouldn't have any of the impact because they will still import their riches and still bully the minorities. That cannot be the debate. But secondly, even on the new world, we think that most of these people are going to be equal. They're going to have equal power since they have like equal base resources that they are beginning with. There is no significant power asymmetry, meaning that these minorities constantly able to hold on and maintain to their wealth, like necessarily accumulate a lot, which means that by the time the second wave comes, they would have money and wealth to necessarily spread much more evenly, right? But then thirdly, like Eziel tells you, wealth is something that compounds over time. And that is the reason why like bigger countries right now have consistently been able to dominate within like when it comes to global economics because they like economically exploited most of the third world countries in that particular regard, hoarding most of the resources, and then that's wealth compounding over time in that particular regard, which means that in the longer run, most of these people who are necessarily left in the global south do not necessarily have any means of climbing the social ladder, but they constantly evolve and constantly get more money. We think that on our side, when there is a much more equitable distribution of these resources, the compounding effect of this wealth is something that significantly helps it, because if you need diversity and inclusivity, you get that from outside of the house. We think that this proves to you that Eziel's quota system is the best system that you could necessarily have in addressing all the problems that we have. I'll get to that. But closing government then, right? Closing government says, and I think their biggest case is that they want to do wealth reconstruction. The way in which they separate themselves from their opening is that they say that this isn't a reparatory metric like their opening wants to claim, but this is something that is different. First of all, 3 responses here. We think that they lie because they say this is not reparatory, but it is literally reparatory because they want to reverse the same social order that harmed these people. They say moral hierarchy or human hierarchy is what caused the collapse of this world, and they want to reverse it. That is still reparation. But secondly, notice that the same moral failure will exist on their side, because on their side, they don't get rid of the human hierarchies, they only reverse it, keeping a specific people in power constantly, meaning that most of these minorities on their side hoard resources, becoming like the dominant control. B, the other people who come, like the second wave people, would not necessarily have the ability to get access to these resources, in as much as they don't prove why these people would have incentive to equitably distribute it in that particular regard. What this means is that they still create that human hierarchies that from their own frame collapse the world. We think that their case is counterintuitive because they kill the world that they seek to protect in the long run. Closing government cannot win this debate, right, in that particular regard. On to opening government then. What do we get from OG? I think we get a lot of interesting things from opening government, right? But let's deal with it systematically. First thing, the biggest thing that opening government wants is that they want inclusivity. They want to include a lot of minorities. What they fail to realize is that minorities are a lot. They don't specifically show what minorities they will be taking there and what they will be leaving behind. Given that there is limited resources, like the Infoslide says, it means that you have limited capacity to be able to take every single person, which means that on their side, their case and their impact is significantly something that is vague. Ours solves that because we tell you how there is representatives from each side, which means that if you buy diversity and inclusivity, you get that best from CCO. But secondly, they say that, this is a world full of suffering and existential crisis, and so the minorities are the most vulnerable. We should take them out first. We tell that in this world, every single person lives in urgency and everybody is vulnerable. Tsunamis don't know the rich. Volcanoes burn the rich people's houses. If the richest money could save them, then we need they wouldn't even necessarily need to leave the current world in that particular regard, because their money is effective. What this means is that every single person is vulnerable within this state. Our side is the only one that factors the diversity of vulnerability within our case, which means we solve OG's principle better. OG. 3, 2.
CG has one.
1. CG, yeah, let me hear you.
Yeah, cool. So you ignore the fact that I told you that because these guys have suffered here, they have an incentive to make sure the systems they build there have empathy. So even if the majority come, they would have to force you. But then also engage my response to your moral worth case, because your principle is losing. Respond.
Listen, so it's very simple here, right? Notice, panel, that Sulemana's case just doesn't work. And here's why. If you say, or if you claim that on your side, people are going to be more sympathetic to, because you are the same person that says that these people have constantly angered them. What you do is that you put them in a situation where you reverse the roles. You don't see why they need to care about those people. You don't prove that, right? It's largely simple. But panel, notice that on their side, there is mutually assured destruction, because everybody now has the capacity. On our side, everybody now has the capacity to necessarily act. So if you don't agree to a constitution that protects everyone, someone might fuck you up later. That fear drives people to want to better the systems on our side. That is better. But on OG, right, notice that OG says that the first people who will land are going to create cultural norms, meaning that they create a much more inclusive society and things like that. Notice that this is not exclusive for 2 reasons. 1, even majorities are ethnically diverse, which means that if we pick majorities, we still get diversity. 2, if you compare this with OO's meritocracy, that is still not exclusive, because even OO samples from diverse cultures and stuff like that, right? But the reason why there is a big problem with opening opposition is that they are they don't literally necessarily solve the case. And you know why? Because notice, this motion is about identities. what identity should necessarily be represented, not like who is more capable in that particular regard. Our extension from closing opposition is the only one that gives you what identity is much more valuable, and that is why the inherent worth of like humans in that particular regard stands, because in as much as Eziel is able to prove to you that humans have equal moral worth, that we always are only on our side that we correct the structural harms that the status quo has done to us, when we necessarily ensure that there is a much more equitable distribution and representation across all identities. Proud.
Thank you very much to the opposition whip speaker.